Okay, Dad. Welcome to the Tailwind Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
We're honored to have you and very excited to talk about your new book today. So, as with all of your books, The Highest Calling is a collection of interviews that you've done about the topic that you're focusing on, which in this case is the American presidency. And I'm going to start by asking the question that you asked many of the authors you talked to for this book. What prompted you to write this?
Well, I worked as a young man in the White House when I was 27 years old. I spent 4 years there with President Carter. And when you work in the White House, you obviously come to an appreciation of the importance of the presidency in our country's history. As a young man, before I went to the work at the White House, I was always interested in the presidency. And in college and other times, I'd read everything I could read about the presidency, enamored probably by John Kennedy, who was elected president when I was in the sixth grade. And I just had a real fixation on the presidency. After I left the White House, I came to know other presidents reasonably well. George Herbert Walker Bush was an advisor to my firm. I got to know Joe Biden over the years, and I actually know Donald Trump as well. And I've come to know Bill Clinton. So I thought if I could do an interview book around interviews I had done and some that I would do with scholars on presidents and presidents themselves, it might be interesting for people who would learn more about the presidency. And most importantly, I wanted to use it as a platform to get people excited about the presidency and to encourage them to vote. We have 160 million people who vote typically in a presidential election, but 80 million people who are eligible to vote do not vote. And I think it'd be better for our democracy if more people voted.
You point out in the book that the likelihood of becoming president and emerging from it alive, healthy, and with a positive reputation around the country is fairly modest. Do you think that that dynamic has become more or less true in modern times, or was it pretty much always like that?
Well, we tend to always think that our times are different than previous times. Very few presidents emerged with spectacular reputations. Even George Washington had his critics, though he did emerge with a pretty good reputation. But John Adams did not emerge with a great reputation. He was defeated for re-election. But in modern times, when you think about it, John Kennedy, the president I talked about earlier, was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson was driven out of office because of the Vietnam War and chose not to run for re-election. Richard Nixon was forced to resign because of Watergate. Gerald Ford could not get reelected. My boss, Jimmy Carter, did not get reelected. Ronald Reagan was almost assassinated, and then he had a scandal that almost ruined his presidency, Iran-Contra. George Herbert Walker Bush was not reelected. Bill Clinton had the scandal that led to an impeachment, and while his reputation got better, he obviously had some real troubles as president of the United States. So my point is that people run so hard to try to become president. They spend years of their life trying to become president, but the chances of emerging with your reputation intact after serving 2 full terms is very limited. In my lifetime, Dwight Eisenhower has probably emerged as one of the few people who served 2 terms, and his reputation was as good going out as it was going in. I think you could probably say the same with Barack Obama. It wasn't as well known as Eisenhower was, but when he emerged as president and left the presidency, I think his reputation was reasonably good among most people in the United States, not everybody, of course.
Yeah, it seems like he might be more of the exception than the rule on this one.
Correct.
So the book, in a lot of ways, is a story of American history, and you go in chronological order with the presidents you cover. So let's start at the beginning. On the sort of same note as what we just talked about, did George Washington enjoy being president?
He hated it. George Washington, when he finished the Revolutionary War, he went back to Mount Vernon, and he basically wanted to retire, and he was basically wanted to run his farm, his estate, plantation. He was importuned to come back into public life and to chair the Constitutional Convention, which he did, and help with the ratification. But he didn't want to be elected president. However, he was importuned to do so. And one of the reasons he did not want to be president was because no male member of his family had ever lived past the age of 50, and he was at the time 57. But he was importuned to do it. After a few months of being president, he hated it. He wanted to quit after just a few months because the confirmation process for some of the appointees he had turned out to be more complicated than he thought. He actually went up to the Senate to talk about some of the appointees he had, and he had a difficult time with senators who didn't treat him with the respect that he thought he deserved. He thought about resigning, but he actually stayed. He thought about not running for a second term. He ultimately did. But he could have run for another term, but he said 2 terms was enough, and he stepped down. But he did not enjoy the presidency, I think it's fair to say.
I picked up that there has been a bit of variance, I guess, in the actual desire to be president that a lot of the presidents mentioned in the book had. Some of them found themselves in that position through a bit of happenstance. Maybe it was fame for other reasons, political pressure, right place, right time. So first of all, do you agree with that? That a lot of the men you talked about in this book had sort of different levels of the intensity of desire that they had to be president.
Yes. Take presidents in the 20th and 21st century. Only one of them, in my view, had an intense desire as a young man to be president of the United States, and that was Bill Clinton. The rest were not student leaders or anything that anybody thought would likely lead to the presidency, though some had distinguished backgrounds, but they were not burning in their desire to be president of the United States as young men. As they got into politics, a few of them, I think, did have a burning desire to be president. One of them was, of course, Bill Clinton that I mentioned. I think he was, from the time he was elected governor of Arkansas at a very young age, I think 30 years old, he was interested in being president. There's no doubt about it. Joe Biden, the current president, was elected to the Senate when he was 29 and a half and sworn in when he was 30, which is the constitutional age you have to be. And he, I think from that point on, was interested in being president. He ran 3 times before he was successful. He had, I think, a burning desire to be president, but I wouldn't say many of them did. Many of them were not really that interested in it. Dwight Eisenhower turned down the opportunity to run for president many times. In fact, Harry Truman asked him to run as a Democrat, and Truman said he wouldn't run. He would support Eisenhower, but Eisenhower chose not to run, so he didn't have a burning desire. Some people just didn't really want to be president, and they kind of fell into it. Calvin Coolidge was governor, became vice president, and to his surprise, Warren Harding died, and Coolidge all of a sudden becomes president, a job he never really thought he wanted. So, yes, some people have a burning desire for it, and some people really prefer not to be president, but they stumbled into it.
One of the things that could be sort of a deterrent for someone running for president is the process of campaigning. So we're in the midst of a campaign right now. How has the process of campaigning to be president changed over the years?
Well, it's changed because it's lengthened. Donald Trump announced 2 years before the election of this time that he was going to be a candidate. Some people will spend 2 years or more running for president of the United States. My former boss, Jimmy Carter, spent about 2 years running for president, and that's fairly typical these days, spending at least a year, if not 2 years, openly running for president. Because you have to file with the FEC, many people don't want to file with the FEC and make the disclosure requirements, so they don't actually start running until a year before the presidential election. But generally, some are now doing it 18 months, and as Donald Trump did, 2 years. So that's changed. The length is much greater. Second, money. This presidential campaign we're going through now, probably about $8 billion. $8 billion will be spent on the presidential campaign. So in the early days, we didn't spend very much. George Washington, I doubt, spent anything to get to be elected president. Clearly a different time. So the time period to run is greater. The money needed to run is much greater. And I think the personal attention paid to the candidates is much greater, and the need to campaign is much greater. Abraham Lincoln never campaigned for president. In the 19th century, it was not considered appropriate to go out and campaign for yourself. So the candidates in the 1800s never actually campaigned for themselves. Now you have to go out and campaign actively and put yourself forward. And the amount of time you have to spend doing it is fairly considerable. So all those things have changed. The length of period of time, the money involved, and the need to personally campaign in virtually all over the country to become president is a big change as well.
Yeah, that was one thing I learned in the book that I did not know. I didn't realize that back in the 1800s, the candidates didn't actually do the campaigning themselves. It seemed like it was basically their friends and sort of confidants that would go out there and do the campaigning on their behalf. While they basically sat at home, and then I guess at some point they would be told whether or not they won.
It was very unseemly to put yourself forward in that way. And so, let's say McKinley, who was elected president in the late part of the 19th century, he basically famously just sat on his porch in Ohio and just, occasionally people would come by and talk to him, but he didn't go out and actively campaign. And the same was true of Abraham Lincoln. He never actually campaigned actively himself. It just was a very uncommon thing to put yourself forward in that way. That all began to change, I would say, in the mid to latter part of the 20th century. Even FDR, when he was first running for president, didn't really campaign all that actively.
One of the presidential stories that I enjoyed reading about the most was that of Ulysses S. Grant. So to get into his biography a little bit, what was he doing prior to becoming a leader in the Union Army?
Ulysses S. Grant was a person who went to the military academy because it was free, and that was the only thing his father really wanted to pay for, was a free place. Father didn't really want to pay for him to go to a college that cost money. Ulysses S. Grant didn't do particularly well there, didn't really enjoy it, though he was a good horseback rider. Ultimately, he went into the military, served in the Mexican-American War, but after the Mexican-American War, he was assigned to a post in California, and it was more or less forced to resign from the Army because he was seen as an alcoholic. It's not completely clear exactly whether he was forced to resign or they were going to court-martial him if he didn't resign, but he left more or less because he was an alcoholic. And therefore, he went to look for a job in the civilian area, and he never really could find one. The only job he could find was chopping wood on a farm that was owned by one of his relatives. And he chopped the wood into firewood and went into the nearby streets of St. Louis to sell firewood to people on the street. So here he is. War breaks out in 1860. In 1860, he's selling firewood on the streets of St. Louis. 8 years later, he's elected president of the United States. So pretty unusual situation.
Do you think that type of rise, is that possible anymore, or was that sort of a thing of the past? Like someone having that much political success that quickly?
Well, Donald Trump himself, when you think about it, he was campaigning when he first ran for president in 2016 against 16 other Republican candidates. There was a total of 17 that ran in the Republican primaries at one point or another. He had no government background, had never been in the military, and as a result, he was the first president ever elected president of the United States with no government or military background. So you could say he came from nowhere in many ways. He was well known publicly, but he wasn't a person of government experience. Barack Obama was a relatively unknown senator. He'd only been in the Senate for, I think, about 2 years before he actually decided to run. So when you think about it, it's possible to come from nowhere. And that's the story of my former boss. Jimmy Carter was a one-term governor from Georgia. And he decided, look, I have nothing else to do. I can't serve 2 terms as governor of Georgia. It wasn't permitted then. So he went to Iowa. Basically had the idea that you go from Iowa, if you win Iowa by intensely getting to know people, you could propel yourself to New Hampshire. If you win New Hampshire, you're off to the races. That's exactly what happened. Though ironically, while Iowa was still a big deal, Carter won Iowa, quote, won, with getting relatively few votes. Today, it takes about 150,000 votes to win the Democratic caucuses in Iowa. Carter got 12,000 votes. That's all. And he didn't even come in first. He came in second to undecided. So undecided came in first. Carter came in second, but he was able to use that publicity to propel himself to New Hampshire and ultimately to the presidency. So I think it is possible still.
On a similar note, some of the presidents discussed were people that from a young age showed great ability, smart, captain of sports teams, the whole thing. Others, though, did not, and many of them probably would not have been considered most likely to succeed in their high school classes. As you've learned about these presidents over the years, does that surprise you at all? Is there some sort of chip on the shoulder thing that sort of propels a lot of these people who ultimately run and then win the presidency?
The presidency reflects life itself. So if you look at the CEOs of large corporations, the presidents of universities, the heads of foundations, people that are members of the Senate, people who are governors, it's not always the case that they were a child superstar, president of student government, a Rhodes Scholar, or something like that. Very often the opposite is the case. So the people that tend to rise up very often are people that got a lucky break at some point in the latter part of the first third of their life and then got in the second third of their life to somewhere where they could propel themselves forward. So I think it's not a surprise that many presidents were not thought to be presidential timber when they were younger, and then a lot of right circumstances happened. For example, take George Herbert Walker Bush. He was interested in being president, but he had no qualifications in the traditional sense. He had run for statewide office twice in Texas, ran for the Senate twice, and lost twice. So he never got elected in his own home state. He was defeated twice, but then through a series of jobs, he got as head of the CIA and as the ambassador to China and ambassador to the UN, he was able to keep his public name alive. And then he was picked to be vice president by Ronald Reagan, to his surprise. I think Bush didn't think he would be selected. So you never can tell how the fortuitous of life will come forward. And anybody probably can rise up to be president of the United States with a lot of luck and things like that happening. It's not impossible for almost anybody to become president. So we've had 2 prohibitions, I'd say. One is you have to be an American native-born citizen. That's required by the Constitution. And to date, I think it's fair to say everybody who has been elected president has been a man. Now, there's a presidential candidate now who's a woman, and maybe she'll win. But to date, for over 200 plus years, we have not elected a woman.
One theme you talk about is that a president's reputation can change over time after they leave office. So what the reputation they have when they leave office is not fixed forever. Off the top of your head, which presidents come to mind who you think maybe have had a positive reversal in their reputation over time?
Well, two that I'll mention. One, Harry Truman. He left office with one of the lowest popularity ratings of American in history. He was thought to be not qualified for the job. And yet, in recent years, because of a biography written about him by David McCullough, which won the Pulitzer Prize, people have relooked at him and they say, well, he took great courage in dropping the atomic bomb, which may have shortened the Second World War. We don't know for certain, but that's what generally people think. He helped to create the UN, helped to create the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, NATO, the CIA, many of which are still with us. And he also desegregated the federal employee workforce. In other words, federal employees in Washington, D.C. were segregated, and he integrated them. And he also integrated the military. The military had been more or less segregated. So as a result of what he did, I think people come to look at him much more favorably. Another one is my former boss, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was not able to get reelected in 1980. Many people thought he was overmatched for the job. But now people are looking at him and saying, well, for 44 years, he's had a post-presidency, which makes people think better of him. And they've looked at his presidency and re-examined it and realized he got a fair bit done, though not everything he wanted. The reverse has actually happened a couple of times. Some people who used to be considered great, their reputations went down after a period of time. Most visibly, recently, is Woodrow Wilson, who was thought to be a great proponent of democracy, making the world safe for democracy, as he said when he tried to end World War I. But then he segregated the federal workforce. He showed the movie Birth of a Nation, which praises the Ku Klux Klan at the White House. And most significantly, he and his wife misled the American people about the state of his health. For the last 18 months or so of his presidency, he had a stroke and he was unable to really perform the duties, and therefore his wife was effectively acting as president. That was hidden from the American people at the time, and it really was a big disservice to the country.
How much of a president's popularity when they're president do you think is out of their control? In other words, the occurrence of bad luck or sort of negative bad events that happen during their presidency, do you think those types of events tend to sort of dictate their popularity, or is it more about how they respond?
Well, to some extent, you can't control events. So when Jimmy Carter was president, that Russia invaded Afghanistan. So that wasn't something that Carter probably could have prevented. Now, maybe he could have prevented the hostage taking on Iran because he did let the Shah into the United States under great pressure to do so, and maybe that was his fault. But some things are just beyond your control. So, for example, when there was an assassination of a European royal family member, that led to World War I. And then ultimately, although Wilson wanted to keep us out of World War I and fought very hard to keep us out of World War I initially, he ultimately sent troops over there, and we lost more than 100,000 American service people in World War I. So, some things are just beyond your control. You just can't really control all of world events. And sometimes if you don't respond appropriately, you'll be heavily criticized. And even if you do respond appropriately, people will still blame you, saying it shouldn't have happened anyway.
Mm-hmm. One thing that becomes clear in reading these chapters is that presidents have had a range of different working styles. Some are detail oriented and like to sit in meetings with their staff and work for long periods of time. And others are more sort of high level visionaries, maybe. You worked in the Carter administration. Where did he fall on that spectrum?
Carter was a man who thought he was generally the smartest man in the room at any given time, and therefore he generally liked to make decisions himself, and to do that, he would read everything. If you gave him a 300-page memo, he would read it. He was a relentless person in terms of paying attention to details. He was an engineer by training, and engineers often pay attention to details, of course. So Carter was a person who was that way. He just spent too much time in the weeds, some people would say, and didn't worry about the big picture. His successor, by contrast, spent very little time in the weeds and focused on the big picture. His presidency was considered more successful. So probably spending too much time in the weeds or too much on the detail probably bogs you down a bit. And I think Carter, to some extent, suffered from that.
So you didn't just interview authors for this book. You also interviewed some of our living presidents. In speaking with the presidents directly, how apparent is it that their personalities and working styles differ quite a bit?
Well, they are much different. George W. Bush, who I got to know through his father, was a person who didn't really show a great interest in politics as a young man. Then he ran for governor, elected twice. Then he ran for president, elected twice. And now that he's not president, he's not really that involved in politics, doesn't want to get involved in public policy, is content to do family-related things and to do painting and philanthropic things with his library. And so, that's just the way he is. He's different. I would say Joe Biden is a person who's very happy to talk about his childhood, very happy to talk about politics, very engaged in public policy. I imagine he'll stay engaged when he's a former president as well. I think George W. Bush probably doesn't spend that much time on public policy now, though if you interview him, as I did, he does have obviously views on things, but he's not running around trying to make policy or influence policy these days. I think Barack Obama is trying to have some impact on policy and is obviously more involved politically than probably the other former presidents who are alive. Donald Trump is unique in many ways. I've known him for a long time, and I don't know if he doesn't get elected this time how deeply involved he'll stay in politics. I just don't know. But each of these presidents get along differently with each other, and so most of them have some relationship with each other, except I think Donald Trump probably doesn't really have a relationship with any of the other former presidents to speak of.
Right. As you've spent time with former presidents who are currently living and then other ones throughout your life and learned more about the presidents that you covered in this book, what do you think being president does to them personally? How does the experience change that?
Well, when you become president, you're sitting in the Oval Office, all of a sudden you realize the gravity of the job you have. You're making decisions that are going to affect all 7 or 8 billion people on the face of the earth. In the old days, when George Washington was president, we had 3 million people in the country. Your decisions would probably affect most of the 3 million people, maybe not even all of them, but most of them, let's say. Now you're making decisions that are going to affect not only everybody in the country, 330 million Americans, but everybody around the world. So it does begin to make them feel the awesomeness of the job, and that's why people often say it's a very lonely job, because in the end, you have to make the decision yourself. There's nobody you can buck the decision to. If it's a hard decision, you're going to have to make it. If it was an easy decision, other people would have made it already. So I think the enormity of the job hits them. Very often you can see it on their faces when they meet the outgoing president for the first time. So when Donald Trump met with Barack Obama, Ronald Reagan met with Jimmy Carter, you could see that they began to realize, hey, this isn't just a job I'm campaigning for. I actually have to do this job, and now the whole world is depending on me for thoughts about what I should be doing. So I do think that they begin right at the beginning of their presidency, or even before the beginning of the presidency, to realize the enormity of the job.
There's a famous photo of JFK. He's looking down, like he's looking sort of melancholic at the beginning of his presidency. And I think what the context that's usually attributed to it is that he is frustrated with how little effect he can make happen in the role of the U.S. president. So despite it being probably the most powerful job in the world, do a lot of presidents also have a frustration that they can't make the exact changes that they want to make?
Yes, because the way the system was set up, Congress has to approve a lot of things, particularly anything relating to spending of money, or then including taxes. So presidents can't get always what they want through Congress. And even if you have, like Jimmy Carter had a majority of the House, majority of the Senate were both Democrats, and a big majorities, he couldn't get everything he wanted through. So presidents tend to think, wow, I have the most powerful position in the world, but I can't really do everything I want. So that's why a lot of presidents turn to foreign policy, because in foreign policy, you can more or less make the decisions yourself. You have to get congressional approval sometimes for appropriations related to some of the foreign policy decisions. And obviously, there's always going to be oversight, and there's a bureaucracy you have to deal with as well. But presidents like to go into foreign policy because in the end, they can make the decisions. It's much more something that they feel they can control. And yes, it's frustrating for all presidents that they can't get everything they want out of Congress, and they can't get everything they want out of the federal bureaucracy. But I think in the end, people who've had the job are glad they had the job. I think very few of them would say after they left the presidency, they wish they hadn't done the job. They wouldn't say that. They obviously had problems doing the job in some cases, but I don't think anybody leaves the presidency saying, I wish I hadn't been president.
In terms of interacting with Congress, it seemed like there was also a bit of variance with regard to the willingness that presidents have had to sort of do the kind of socializing and kind of hobnobbing that to some degree is sort of required in DC if you work in politics. Do you think having those sort of qualities, the types of presidents that are willing to go to all the dinner parties with Congress people and sort of build relationships that way, do you think that is that always a good quality for presidents to have?
I think it's a great quality for presidents to have, and the president that are willing to socialize will probably get more out of Congress for sure. Members of Congress like to say, I just had dinner with the president. I just saw the president. The president just saw me, just said this to me. I told the president this. That's the currency that people love in Washington, D.C. In the early days of our country, we didn't have communications quite the way we do today. So how did presidents get their word out? They would have parties and give their views to members of Congress that would come to the parties or other important people in Washington. Jefferson famously liked to have a lot of dinner parties at the White House where he could communicate his views to people. And even today, while we have a lot of communications mechanisms and you can know what a president thinks without having to meet him directly, there's nothing like actually seeing a president in person, shaking his hand, getting your picture with him, taken with him today, spending time with the First Lady, saying I went to the state dinners, so I went to the White House. That's a great currency in Washington. And presidents that are willing to put up with all the endless meetings and dinners you have to do, I think do better. So, for example, when you go to the White House today, typically you have what's called a photo line. So you get in line and then the president and the First Lady will get a picture with you. And, they have to stand for an hour at a time to get all the pictures taken, all the people that you've invited to the White House, but that is worth a lot. If you go to a lot of people's homes who are prominent people in the United States or around the world, you'll see they have a picture with the President of the United States, because very often prominent people like to say they've got the picture with the President, and the President has to, go through the ordeal of getting all these pictures taken. But that's what makes the system work.
How much politically do you think it can benefit a sitting president, maybe who wants to run for re-election, to do a lot of press conferences and to speak to the American people that way?
Well, of course, press conferences are a relatively novel invention. I think FDR used to probably perfected it. He would have people come and stand around his desk in the Oval Office and talk to reporters. I think John Kennedy made it even better, people would say, by not only having regular press conferences scheduled every other week, but he would do it on television, live on television. And so people got a chance to see the president every other week or so, answering questions that were, probably anticipated, but still he had to have some wit about him to answer those questions and know what he was talking about. I think presidents that don't give a lot of press conferences, I think, suffer from it. President Biden hasn't given a lot of press conferences. Maybe that was a problem that some people felt he should have given more press conferences. I'll leave others to judge whether that's true or not. Donald Trump didn't have regular press conferences, but he was talking to the press from time to time. Some presidents just really don't like to give press conferences. That's not their forte. So I think generally if you can give press conferences and you're regularly talking with the press, even if it's not a formal press conference, I think there's a plus to it. On the other hand, Jimmy Carter regularly had press conferences, and it didn't seem to make him more popular. He had a lot of press conferences. He did it fairly regularly, and it was all televised, but he just didn't seem to be able to do it in a way that made people think better of him.
Are there any changes you think we should make to our presidential election system?
Yes, there are a number of them, and I mentioned in the book. I think it'd be great if we could do some things which are unrealistic. We're not going to change the electoral college system, though I think that system, obviously is not perfect because it doesn't represent pure democracy, but that's not going to change. I don't think unless we change the Constitution, which is unlikely, we're going to get money out of politics. I think that's unrealistic. I think it would be a good idea if presidents would disclose their tax returns. I think it would be a good idea if there was some kind of blind trust for presidents, which are not required now. I think it would be a good idea if presidents disclose their health in meaningful ways, because right now there's no requirement to disclose any health information. Sometimes you get as very modest information. I think that would be a good idea as well, among other things that I think could be done to improve the system.
One of the ideas in there I thought was great, in addition to others, is the requirement for a transition team to start working, I think, on both sides, the outgoing president and the incoming president. The outgoing president has to have a dedicated transition team that's set up 3 months before that president leaves office.
Yes, transitions are things that presidents didn't pay that much attention to in the early days. John Kennedy did not have any real pre-election transition team. After he won the election, he then began to figure out who he should put into the cabinet and so forth and so on, but it was very haphazard. Today, we have a system where the federal government will pay for, in effect, transition efforts after you won the presidency, but even before presidents or presidential candidates are setting aside money to help with the pre-election transition. Right now, there is a pre-election transition effort by Kamala Harris. She has a team working on it, and there's one with Donald Trump that's working on it. And I think if you can do a pre-election transition, once you win the election, you're ready to go, and you can work on the real transition, knowing that, in fact, you are going to be making appointments and you're making policy decisions. So I think transitions are helpful. Remember, the transition used to be much longer. We used to elect presidents in November, and they were inaugurated in March. Now they are inaugurated in January, so they're a relatively shorter period of time. And we've had some times when presidents didn't really take advantage of it. So when Biden was elected, Donald Trump did not allow there to be a transition for a while, and that short-circuited many of the opportunities that were available to Biden. And when George W. Bush was elected, he didn't know that he was going to be president for about a month after the election. And so that short-circuited the ability of George Bush to do many of the things he would do in a transition. In other words, because of the contested election in 2000, George Bush really couldn't begin this transition effort in seriousness until probably a month after the election.
As someone who has worked in a White House and has studied a lot of American presidents, what advice would you give to an incoming president?
Talk to your predecessors, see what advice they have. Get an experienced White House chief of staff who actually knows Washington and you trust. Meet regularly with your top cabinet officer, particularly your Secretary of State, because that person is going around the world representing you, and you can't let there be any distance between you and your Secretary of State. Pay attention to the details. Try to be open as possible with the public about your views on things, and have regular press conferences or press meetings with reporters, and try to enjoy the job. If you hate the job, you're probably not going to do it that well. So try to find things in the job you really enjoy and spend a fair amount of time on that. And also keep notes. While notes can be subpoenaed and so forth, they also help you write your autobiography, which I think is helpful to the country. So record your notes, record your thoughts, keep regular diaries about what you're doing as president, because it'll be invaluable to you later as you begin to write your autobiographies.
Okay, Dad, last question might be a difficult one to give a definitive answer about, but if you had to choose one president in terms of the positive impact that they had on the country, who would it be?
There's one president, in my view, who stands above everybody else, and that's Abraham Lincoln. Although Lincoln was relatively inexperienced, he only served 2 years in Congress before he became president, he saved the nation. It wasn't obvious that the country wanted to keep the Union together. Many people in the North at the time that Lincoln was elected said, well, let the South go to their own way. If they want to have their own country, goodbye. We don't need them. We don't like their slavery and their forms of slavery and what they're doing with slavery. Let them go. Lincoln felt it was important to hold the Union together. He fought a war through difficult circumstances, won the war. He freed the slaves through the Emancipation Proclamation, later through the 13th Amendment. Had he lived, I think Reconstruction would have worked better. But he did all this with humility. He didn't brag about this. He didn't run around the White House saying, I won the Civil War. I just issued the Emancipation Proclamation. I just gave the Gettysburg Address. Aren't I great? He had humility, and I think that's a very good quality. And I think for those reasons that I've just cited, I think he was by far our greatest president.
Dad, thank you for coming on the podcast. It's much appreciated. Yeah, I look forward to your next book, whatever that topic is going to be.
Okay, thanks a lot. Appreciate your having me. Bye.